The UAP Harold Case File 005, Rendlesham Forest. In the winter of 1980, the deputy commander of a United States Air Force base in England walked into a dark forest with a tape recorder running and recorded himself reacting in real time to something he could not explain. 2 weeks later, he put it in an official memo to the British government. They have never explained it either. This is not a story about a believer. The man at the center of it is a career officer. The evidence at the center of it is a document and a tape, declassified, on the record, and still open. So the only honest question is the one he was asking that night. What was Charles Halt looking at? Start with the geography, because it matters. 2 air bases sit at the edge of Rendlesham Forest in Suffolk, on the cold east coast of England. RAF Woodbridge and RAF Bentwaters. They are Royal Air Force stations, but in 1980, they are operated by the United States Air Force. This is the front line of the Cold War, and these are serious installations. In the early hours, the consensus date is the 26th of December, a security patrol near the Woodbridge East Gate sees lights coming down into the trees. Their first thought is not spacecraft, it's aircraft. They think a plane has gone down, and there was a perfectly ordinary reason to think so. That very night, a bright fireball, a meteor, had burned up over southern England. Something had genuinely streaked across the sky. 3 men go to look. Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston, Airman First Class John Burrows, and their driver, Airman Ed Cabansac. They go in on foot. What happens next is the most famous and the most disputed part of the entire case, because from the very first night, the 2 men closest to it described 2 different things. Peniston, in accounts he gave later, describes a structured craft on the forest floor.
It was a craft of unknown origin, definitely mechanical in nature.
Burrows, the man right beside him, consistently described something else. Not a landed machine, but lights. Lights in the trees, moving. Hold on to that gap. It is the first crack in the story, and it is there on night 1, between 2 airmen standing in the same forest. We will come back to what Peniston said he did at that craft, and to when he said it. Daylight. The men go back to where they'd been, and they find marks, 3 small depressions in the frozen ground, in a rough triangle, some broken branches, some scorching on the trees, by some accounts. They take plaster casts, and they run a Geiger counter over the site. This is the physical evidence, and we have to be honest about how strong it is, which is weak. Start with the marks. The HALT memo would later describe 3 ground depressions where something might have stood. But the local police came out and looked. Foresters looked, and their assessment, reported by the astronomer Ian Ridpath, was mundane. The depressions were consistent with rabbit diggings and the broken branches with ordinary forestry work, not the landing gear of a craft. Then the radiation. You will hear the figure quoted as if it were alarming. It is not. The memo records readings of about 1/10 of a milliroentgen. That is essentially natural background radiation. The level you'd expect to find in an ordinary forest, on an ordinary day, with no spacecraft anywhere. So, marks were found. A reading was taken. Both are real. Neither one, on its own, proves a single thing landed in that forest. Now the heart of the case. 2 nights later, the 28th of December into the 29th, the lights come back, and this time the deputy base commander goes out himself. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt takes a small team into Rendlesham Forest, and crucially, he takes a micro-cassette recorder, and he narrates what he sees as it happens. This is the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case, because it is not a memory written down years later. It is a senior officer's voice in the forest, in the moment. On the tape, Halt and his men track a light through the trees.
There it is again. It's coming this way.
He describes it pulsing, glowing. At one point,
It's like an eye winking at you. It almost burns your eyes.
later in the night, he describes lights in the sky to the north, and one of them sending a beam of light down toward the ground near them. You can hear the men's adrenaline. You can hear them trying to be precise. These are not people performing for a camera. There was no camera. There was a tape and the dark. Then, on the 13th of January 1981, about 2.5 weeks after the events, Halt writes it up. One page, subject line, Unexplained Lights, on US Air Force letterhead, addressed to the British Ministry of Defence, and, this surprises people, it is unclassified. The memo describes the first night's object in flat military language, metallic in appearance and triangular in shape, approximately 2 to 3 meters across the base, with a pulsing red light on top and a bank of blue lights underneath. And it describes the later lights, a red, sun-like light that moved and pulsed, and at one point broke into 5 separate white objects. That memo would sit more or less unknown until June of 1983, when it was released under the U.S. Freedom of Information Act to a researcher named Robert Todd. That is how the world found out. Not a leak, a FOIA request. So set the believer claims aside entirely for a moment. Strip it all back. What you are left with is this: a deputy base commander on tape reacting to lights he couldn't explain, and then documenting them in writing to a government ministry. That part is not in dispute. That part is the file, which brings us to the other side of the table. And on this case, the skeptic's argument is strong, specific, and deserves to be heard in full. Its leading voice is the astronomer Ian Ridpath. Ridpath's case has 3 parts. 1. The trigger, the thing that pulled the patrol into the forest in the first place. Remember that fireball, the bright meteor that burned up over southern England just before 3 in the morning on the 26th. Ridpath argues that's what they saw come down, not a craft crashing, a meteor ending. 2. The flashing light they then chased through the trees. About 5 miles to the east, on the coast, stands the Orford Ness lighthouse, and here's the detail that makes the argument land. The timing. On Halt's own tape, the light flashes at roughly 5-second intervals. The Orford Ness lighthouse flashed at almost exactly that rate. A rotating coastal beacon glimpsed through a moving screen of trees can look like it's hovering, pulsing, even pacing you. 3. The star-like lights later in the night. Ridpath's answer there is simply bright stars and planets, the brightest one, low in the south, being Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. Now the witnesses pushed back, and we have to be fair to them too. Charles Halt has maintained for decades that he knew where the lighthouse was, that he could see it separately, and that it was not what he was reporting. He says the men weren't fooled by a beacon they'd all seen 1,000 times. We are not going to pretend that resolves itself. A lighthouse, a meteor, and Sirius is a genuinely powerful explanation for a lot of this, and a decorated officer insisting he could tell the difference is not nothing. Hold both, and now the part of the story we hold at arm's length, because it is the part that did not exist in 1980. Over the years that followed, the Rendlesham story grew, and some of what grew onto it is not in the contemporaneous record at all. The most famous example, the binary code. Sergeant Penniston has said that when he touched the craft, he received a stream of information, a binary code, that he later wrote in a notebook and decades on, decoded into English. A message about coordinates, about humanity, about time travelers. It is a remarkable claim, and here is what you need to know about it. The binary code was revealed publicly in 2010. The narrative content attached to it traces back to a hypnosis session in September of 1994, 14 years after the event. None of it appears in the 1980 reports. None of it has any independent or scientific corroboration. The touched craft itself is contested by the chain of command. Colonel Ted Conrad, who was the base commander at the time, said in 2010 that Peniston had reported only an unknown light, that he didn't get close enough for a detailed look. That is the senior officer above him on the record describing a much smaller event than the one told later. And then there is the account of Larry Warren, co-author of the book Left at Eastgate, who described a far larger event with craft and beings. We are going to be precise here, and only precise. Warren's account is contested by name. Charles Halt has stated that Warren was not present that night. Warren's own co-author, Peter Robbins, has publicly distanced himself from it. The former Ministry of Defense official, Nick Pope, has called it discredited. Larry Warren stands by his account. We are not here to call any man a liar. We are here to tell you exactly who disputes what and let the record stand. That is the layer the documents do not support. We set it down gently and we move on. The record, in order. 26th of December 1980. First lights. The memo itself dates that night to the 27th. The consensus is the 26th. We show you the discrepancy rather than quietly pick one. The morning after, the ground depressions, the Geiger reading. The 28th, Halt's Night, and the tape. The 13th of January 1981, the memo. June 1983, the FOIA release to Robert Todd. 2008 to 2009, the Ministry of Defense files reached the National Archives with the conclusion that has anchored this case ever since. No defense significance. And 2010, the binary code claim. So strip it to the studs. What we know. A deputy base commander recorded himself and his men reacting to lights they could not explain. He documented it in an unclassified official memo to a government ministry. Ground impressions were found, and a radiation reading was taken, and the British Ministry of Defence reviewed the case and concluded it had no defence significance, nothing on radar, no threat to the realm. It could not explain the lights. It simply found nothing that mattered to national security. What we don't know, what the lights actually were, whether anything landed at all, whether the fireball, the lighthouse, and the stars fully account for 3 nights of it. And we'll say this plainly, nothing in the contemporaneous record supports the binary code or the touched craft. The Ministry of Defense did not prove it was aliens, and it did not debunk it. It said, on the record, that it couldn't explain it, and that it didn't have to. 2 nights, 2 airbases, a commander, a tape, and a memo the British government reviewed, and could not explain. Case file 005, Rendlesham Forest, remains open. The UAP Herald. Every document read, every claim cross-referenced, AI investigated and filed. Subscribe, the file stays open.